I am going to give you some random facts about adoption that I think are important to know as you go through the adoption process. Hi, I'm Steffany A. I am the founder and executive director of Adoption and Beyond. I help hopeful adoptive families adopt the child of their dreams, and also I help expecting parents who feel adoption is the right choice for them and their child, help them find the right hopeful adoptive family for their child. So today I'm going to tell you some random adoption facts that I think are important for you to have. So let's start with the first one. So the number of families who are wanting to adopt far exceeds the number of children available for domestic infant adoptions. Now, that statement is not true for foster care adoptions and for international adoptions. For both of those types of adoptions, there are more children available for adoption than there are adopting families. But if you're looking at wanting to adopt an infant domestically through any resource, an agency, a consultant, privately, any of those options, there are, for pre-COVID, I've heard lots of different numbers. One that I always quoted to families pre-COVID was 1 to 40 families looking to adopt. Post-COVID, or kind of, during COVID, now kind of coming out of COVID, I think the number is probably closer to 60 families to every child, because during COVID, the birth rate dropped. And as a result, so do adoptions as well. So there are far more families wanting to adopt per child available to be adopted, infants domestically, than there was pre-COVID. So just know that there are a lot of adoptive families. And this is of the reasons why most adoption professionals, good adoption professionals, will encourage you to network out, will encourage you to work with more than one adoption professional, will encourage you to do your own self-networking and outreach. Those are going to increase your odds of being presented to expecting moms who are going to choose you to adopt their child. Adoptions vary drastically between states. Each state has their own adoption law. There is not a federal law. The closest thing we have to a federal law is Hague accreditation in Hague, and that kind of oversees all international adoptions. That's the closest we have to federal law around adoptions. In general, for the adoption process, it varies from state to state. So give you just an example of here in Kansas and Missouri, two states that we are licensed in, because we're in Kansas City, so we are licensed in both states. And in Kansas, you can finalize your adoption in 30 to 60 days. In Missouri, you finalize your adoption in 6 months. So just to give you an example of how the adoption laws are so drastically different between all the states, that is also includes how they're different in terms of what's allowed for various different things. So, the age you can be to adopt, whether you can pay living expenses or not to an expecting mom, how much and when, and also the number of post-adoption or post-placement reports that are required. So once again, going back between Kansas and Missouri, Kansas requires anywhere from 0 to 1 post-placement. Post-placement reports are reports that when you adopt a child, there's a period of time before you finalize your adoption, and the courts require a certain number of visits being done between you and the agency that did your home study to make sure your placement's going well so you can finalize your adoption. In Missouri, they require 3 post-adoption reports. So those are just some examples of how the different states are very different. Some states allow you to advertise and to self-network yourself and to self-market yourself to expecting moms, and some states don't. So be sure that you hire the right adoption professionals and the right adoption attorneys who know these laws and can help you make sure you don't do something wrong in your adoption process. Did you know that each agency has their own home study process and how they do the home study process with families? Usually the paperwork is the same. Generally, those are outlined by state statutes and state regulations in terms of that oversee adoption. And so the paperwork that you gather is usually the same, although each agency has their own little integral pieces that they may want that another agency doesn't. The amount of education and training that an agency requires, the number of visits that they do to the house, how they structure their interviews, or whether they don't do a lot of interviewing. So those are the things that are very different between agencies, is how they do the home study process. And also along those lines, how they do the adoption process and how many placements they do, and whether they just do local placements or whether they do national placements. So there's a lot of variations between adoption agencies. So don't think that everything is the same and that there's a cookie cutter and that the adoption process is done one way, because I can promise you it's not. There's a zillion different ways to do the adoption process and the home study process. And the final piece of advice, did you know that there are non-for-profit child placing agencies and there are for-profit child placing agencies? Yeah. There are for-profit agencies, or they're not necessarily agencies. They may be adoption professionals or adoption facilitators or adoption law centers, or, those are going to be for-profit versus social service agencies that are nonprofit. So just know that there are differences on how funding is done when it comes to adoption. Like I said, there's no federal regulations over adoption. So therefore, that is the wild, wild west for adoption processes to be set up. And so it's important, if working with a non-for-profit is important to you, that you find out whether they're non-for-profit, or if working with a licensed agency is important to you, find out if they're licensed within their state that they're operating. So just ask these questions. Just know that these things are different and that there is no two same adoptions. So I hope you enter the adoption process with an open heart and an open mind, and you will have a very successful adoption process. So I hope that I get to see you next week. Thank you so much. Bye.